Yeah. Again, welcome everyone. Shrey, do you want to just give a quick intro about a little bit about you and what you've been working on recently for the folks?
Yes, thank you, Alex. Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining. I'm Shreya Datta. My pronouns are he, they, and I'm sorry, I'm gonna change them right now on
I'll
my
do it. It's fine,
screen.
Shrey. You carry on.
But it always forgets. It's always so bad. Um, but yeah, I'm the insights and content analyst. I do everything around data research and training at LGBT Great, and my background actually, background lays in economics and international relations, and very research intensive. And recently, which we're going to talk about in slightly more detail and
Mhm.
probably plug it in. But we're doing the research, which we're going to release very soon, around recruitment in the financial services and beyond. Um, and of course, from an LGBTQ plus perspective. Yeah.
Great. Thank you very much, Shrey. Yeah, so we've got 45 minutes today, so we might not need all of that time. So the slide content we have is fairly light, but we thought it would be a good opportunity to address some kind of high-level points around inclusion. And this is obviously a space for questions, so please feel free to ask questions as we go through. We've put the Slido link on the screen here. We're using Slido because a few of our clients have said that the kind of Zoom Q&A function doesn't always work, or it hasn't been enabled. So we are using Slido as kind of our preferred. But if you have access to the Zoom chat function, you can feel free to pop any questions or thoughts or comments in there as we go through today. Inclusion is the focus area for today. Some of you will have seen that the title of this webinar was to acknowledge National Inclusion Week, which, if anyone has Googled it and knows anything about it, it's not actually this week, is in a couple of weeks. But we thought it would be a good opportunity before National Inclusion Week to essentially establish a bit of a foundational understanding with you today around what inclusion is, why it matters, so that during National Inclusion Week, when there's a lot more of the nuanced conversations happening, that you are prepped and ready to have those effectively. So with that in mind, the objectives for today's session are simple, but hopefully that will mean that we can get to some of the nitty-gritty aspects. What is inclusion? So we'll discuss the importance of inclusion, why it matters, and some of the terminology around that. For those that know LGBT Great and know Shrey and I, we love data, and one of the challenges we experience frequently is that there is a kind of lack of data around the LGBTQ plus community globally. And so what we wanted to do today was to talk about inclusion, but through the lens of some of the most recent data and insights that we've been seeing coming from some of the big players in the industry, but also some of the more niche providers as well. And then we have also a fortnightly news digest where we explore the 5 latest LGBTQ plus inclusion. Well, it's broader than that, really, LGBTQ plus stories from around the world. So we wanted to end today by just sharing a few of the latest things that are happening, really. So the goal is to give you the foundational understanding about the terms, contextualize that with some of the data that's happening around the world, and what we're seeing, and then to spend a bit of time talking about LGBTQ plus inclusion in a global context, which is obviously where we are all in. And I'm sure many of you work for organizations that have a presence across multiple locations, multiple regions, multiple countries. Indeed, in some of those, being LGBTQ plus may actually be illegal. I think it's 67, I think was the latest that I saw that criminalize being, LGBTQ plus. We still have 15 countries in the world that criminalize expressing one's gender in such a way that goes against what they were assigned at birth. So for our trans or binary siblings, there are still places in the world where it is expressly illegal to express yourself. And there are still a number of countries that do have kind of capital punishment for being LGBTQ plus. So yeah, so I mean, this conversation remains important, I think is kind of what we wanted to hopefully share with you today. Shrey, anything else you want to add around the agenda?
No, that's pretty clear.
Fab. Okay, let's go right back to basics. Who is LGBT Great first before we touch on inclusion? For those that know us, hello again, lovely. There do see some names that I recognise. So hi everyone who knows us. I also see some names that I don't recognise. So welcome. If this is the first time you're hearing about LGBT Great and about our work, then it's good that you're here. Let me give you a brief overview of what it is we do. So LGBT Great is a member organization and consulting firm for financial services and professional services. Our focus area is LGBTQ plus diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. And our mission and our vision is to make every organization sort of truly LGBTQ plus friendly and inclusive inside and out. How do we do that? We have a range of things. For those that know us very well, you'll see that this slide has updated in line with our slightly new corporate structure and kind of service line structure that was launched in June this year. So LGBT Great offers 3 types of product and services that sit within an interconnected group of service lines. The first of this is membership, where our corporate members join us on a rolling basis, and they gain access to some insights and learning, a range of visibility programs and a range of outreach programs. We launched a new product 2 weeks ago, LGBT Great Careers, which is a dedicated talent attraction and enablement program, which includes a LGBTQ plus focused job board with a robust due diligence process for assessing, kind of LGBTQ plus inclusivity at target organizations, which does correspond with our IBIT program, for those that are familiar, which is a industry-wide benchmark. And then we have recently reframed how we engage on a consultancy style basis with our clients into LGBT Great Advisory, which is the part of the business that I head up. And so that covers off thought leadership, transformation, and organizational diagnostics. And we've had a question in the chat, what is that for? Not quite sure when that was posted. So if the person who posted that could just give a bit more context, I'll address that more explicitly. Thank you very much. So the goal is really, thank you, Luke, who is on the line. Luke is our Global Membership Relationship Manager and Advisory Consultant. So thanks, Luke. Do feel free to populate the chat with anything. Luke is on hand, which is great. So that's a little bit about us. These are some of the firms that we work with. I'm sure there are some familiar faces there. I can see some names. So good to have some of our members and our stakeholder on the line today. Okay, cool. That's us in a nutshell. Shrey, anything you want to add about our work or what we're doing? No. Okay, good. On to the meat of the sandwich, or I suppose what's the vegan alternative? The tofu of the falafel of the wrap, if you will.
I think that's where we start with the inclusive initiatives.
Is that where we start?
A vegan alternative. I love it. Thank you, Alec.
You're welcome, Shay. Okay, so inclusion is a word that we've all heard. Diversity, equity, inclusion, DE&I, EDI, EDIB, with belonging, equity, equality. These are all terms that are bandied around all the time. There are goals, objectives that are tied to DEI. Some of you on the call may have DEI in your title. You may be DEI managers. You may be part of the HR network. You may have objectives tied to DE&I. We talk about it a lot. Sometimes we miss some of the nuances of it. So I thought in this conversation around inclusion, we just go back to basics and actually just break down when we talk about D, E, and I, what are we actually saying? And hopefully that will just help us contextualize why inclusion specifically is so important. So let's start with the D, with diversity. I think it's pretty simple. So the centers on acknowledging the differences between people, but that can be through lived experience, can be through identity, can be through those socio-cultural, economic factors, and it's basically just each person is unique, and we can acknowledge that there's value in having a diverse workforce. Many of you will have seen stats reports on the business case for diversity. It's pretty old hat, not old hat now. That's actually unfair. But it's a pretty well established idea that improved diversity amongst employee bases breeds better cognitive, breeds better innovation, improves productivity, improves well-being and feelings of community. So, diversity is important. Then the E, we often talk about equity, but I wanted to distinguish between equity and equality, as these are two very important, interconnected, but distinct terms. Equality is the idea that irrespective of those differences, that diversity, everyone is treated the same. I think that's pretty common, pretty clear. Equity is a slightly nuanced take on that, is that equity, we can think about it in terms of outcome, is that we want to ensure that everyone gets the same outcome. And it might be that we have to treat people not differently, but in different ways in order to ensure that those outcomes can be met. So, the baseline is the same, but equity is about ensuring that everyone's different needs are met. The best analogy I always think is around the apple tree. So, the goal from an equality point of view is that everyone gets an apple from the tree. Fine. Diversity would be saying that people's reach is different. People are, their jumping height is different. So, the apple that they can get may be different. Equality is saying that everyone has access to the apple tree, so everyone can just see the apple tree and can access it. Equity is saying, well, in order to reach it, let's give some people ladders of different heights in order for them to reach the same apple. So the outcome is the same, everyone is treated equally, but the equity aspect is that we adjust the experience in order to ensure that that kind of equality of outcome is met. So those are the DE parts. The inclusion is where we center on building an environment in which everyone feels able to thrive. Everyone feels able to get the apple, right? It doesn't matter that I have to use a ladder and Shrey has a trampoline or whatever, or there's someone who's very tall who can just pick up. That's fine. So it doesn't matter the types of diversity that exist within a population, but that inclusion is the feeling of, well, it doesn't matter because we're all in it together. We all get the same outcome. We're all treated fairly and equitably. In a work context, this can be, inclusion can be propagated through policies. So, the sense that I am protected, Shrey is protected in the same way. Inclusion can also be very cultural. It can be about how you interface with your employees, your team members, the wider business, in building a sense that people feel safe psychologically, physically, of course, but also psychologically. And this idea of inclusion is really where the soft side, the feeling is so important, because ultimately, something like equality and equity and the feeling of being, equal, begets a feeling of inclusion as well. Maybe I'm making a hash of that, but I think that's pretty much how we've described that in the past. I hope that's useful. Some of you may be sitting there thinking, yeah, Alex knew that, get on to the next bit. But I hope that some of you have found that distinction interesting. Shrey, anything you want to add on the DEI kind of inclusion intro?
Yeah, I think I agree with everything you said. And I feel like, in my mind at least, how I see inclusion is, or at least like utopic, quote unquote, perfect inclusion, is the addition of diversity, equity, and equality together. So, like, for example, the workforce is diverse, everyone's treated equally and equitably, then I think the final outcome becomes inclusion in its most in its best form and manner. So I think that's like that, at least in my mind, clears it up, because sometimes a lot of concepts like intertwine and people are like, oh,
Yeah.
I don't know how to navigate it. But in my mind, that's how I'd see it. And I feel like inclusion is like the final outcome of it, as you said.
Agreed. Many people actually want to include belonging as well into that DEIB. This is where we have this sense of well-being as well. So, physical well-being, mental well-being, medical well-being, psychological well-being, is that feeling you have a sense of inclusive belonging. So you are included in everything, but that you are also acknowledged, that you are given a community that you feel that you belong to, even if everyone is very diverse. We can be bound together by mutual respect, by a shared goal toward understanding each other. In corporate programs around DE and I, often it's can be a bit heavy-handed, where we say, right, on this day we talk about this issue, on this day we talk about this identity, on this day we talk about this identity, etc. LGBT Pride Month, with Bisexuality Visibility Day, Black History Month, Disability Awareness Month. All of these things are really important because they provide a space consciously to talk about things that we don't normally talk about. It goes back to equity there, which is artificially creating opportunities for equal conversation. So I think inclusion is something that is really important. And my first point would be that inclusion is something you can work on as an organization, and you can work towards building inclusive environments and cultures proactively and consciously. So it doesn't have to just happen. It's something that organizations do work on, and that we at LGBT Great can work with you to achieve. Okay, that's the foundation. So in National Inclusion Week, in a couple of weeks, hopefully you'll all be sitting there going, yeah, know all of this. This is great. Alex and Trey gave a great foundation for us to have these more nuanced conversations. But let's take this conversation now to the LGBTQ plus community explicitly. So in the context of LGBTQ plus people and the wider community, why does inclusion kind of matter? And I said earlier that there were some reports that have come out recently that I think help paint that picture of why this conversation matters, specifically in the context of the LGBTQ plus community. I have to say, I'm a big fan of this report. So June this year, Ipsos Mori, the global market research firm, many of you, I'm sure, have read their reports before or worked with them, done their surveys, did one of the largest studies that I've seen on the LGBTQ plus population globally. So 30 countries, 22,000 respondents. They asked a range of questions around how people identify, how LGBTQ plus people navigate the world. And there's loads that you could include here on this. So please go and check the report out in full. We're not sponsored by Ipsos Mori, but if anyone is from Ipsos Mori and wants to sponsor us, I am actually open to that conversation. But there are just a few things that really struck me, and I wanted to share a few of them with you today around why this conversation of inclusion matters. The first very clear reason is because this impacts a lot of people. I'm not sure what people came into this thinking about the community, how big it was, but the latest figures, at least from Ipsos, show that 16% of Gen Z identify as being LGB plus, so lesbian, gay, bi plus, it includes pan and other sort of sexualities as well, compared with 8% of people when averaged across all ages. So already we can see there's that's quite a big population. Then when we factor in gender identity, we have 6% of Gen Z identify as being trans, non-binary, or gender diverse, compared with only 3% when average across all ages. Put those two together, we've got over 20% of people identifying as being part of the LGBTQ plus community. So over 20% is amazing as a statistic, because I do think that some of the things we struggle with sometimes is, particularly if you're not part of the community, is kind of remembering just how big it is and how diverse it is. Yes, it's not a monolith. Yes, it's broad. So inclusion from an LGBTQ plus perspective is important because first and foremost, it impacts 1 in 5 young people. I mean, that's a pretty compelling thing if you're a senior leader thinking about the future of your talent. This is something you need to be talking about. But also when looked at across all age groups, we're in above 10% of people here. So 1 in 10 people being part of the community. That's a significant population that we need to be working to support. So inclusion matters because it impacts lots of people. I think that is the first thing. Going back to that comment about equity, actually, I'll pause. Shrey, did you want to come in on the growth of the community, or anything around that, being part of the Gen Z population yourself?
Yeah, thank you, Alex. Yeah, I mean, I just think, because I feel like I was reading this statistic very recently, about like how left-handedness has increased over the last century. And this was like a US statistic from 1900 to 2010, I think. It's gone up from like 2% to 12%. And the reasoning behind it was the left-handed people were demonized throughout history, persecuted, And there's this entire idea of, oh, like LGBTQ plus people are really increasing, but actually, I personally believe we're not increasing. We're just more comfortable with who we are, and we can be who we are, just um no, and like just outside and like in public. And I feel like that increment is very important, because now that left-handed people are, for example, not persecuted,
Mhm.
or and these are like some very interesting like discriminations over for left-handed people brought through religion, culture,
Mhm.
tradition. So, for example, in ancient Mesopotamia, Egyptians, Greeks, or Romans, like the Western culture is always like with the gods. They're like the right hand is a blessing and the left hand is a curse.
Mm.
Um, in the same way, like a lot of just generally cultures were like, oh, for example, if you go back to the roots of like the word sinister, it actually means left.
Mhm.
And what you think of like the word left, in its Latin roots lie in the word left, which is interesting, right? So again, like this constant demonization of the community is what actually brought the numbers down, in my opinion. And then, of course, now we're like in a state which is obviously much better than where we were 100 years ago. And I think, like, as someone who is part of Gen Z, like being brought up and being like not conforming to gender was like not frowned upon as much as I assume other people from
Mm.
other generations were. And we saw that in like the role modeling report as well, where we saw like so if there were like five age brackets, 18 to 24, 24 to 35, and so on, like for each age bracket that you go up, there was a 42% less chance that you would find an LGBTQ plus role model in social media,
Mm.
which is interesting to see, because like people find the globalization is such an important factor to understand how LGBTQ plus people are in front of you and they're represented. And when you see yourself being represented, you're included in some way and form, be it virtually, digitally, or in reality. So I think that's like my thought on like
That's
the
a good.
increment. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean I mean I am left-handed. And I remember growing up, my grandfather is also left-handed, but he went to a, small Catholic school in near Felixstowe in the south of England, and that was, staffed by nuns who
Mm.
beat it out of him. Trigger warning. He used to have a cane every time he wrote with his left hand. It was beaten. So he now is right-handed, or he says he's ambidextrous, but he paints with his left hand. When he retired, he got into painting, so he still paint, but he writes with his right hand. So it was. Yeah, that's a very interesting statistic actually, and something that speaks to something that I, yeah, saw growing up, or at least the effects of that. So that's fascinating. But yeah, no, no, still left-handed, but like, still LGBTQ. But he's not LGBTQ plus, but still LGBTQ plus. But the acknowledgement of it, the experiential factors of being it, changing over time, leading to more people openly, discussing. I can see there's been the conversation in the chat. Thank you, Ariana, around the LGB plus acronym. I would say very openly, there's no LGB without the T. The only reason I've done it here is because that's how it was reported in the stats, just to differentiate between sexual orientation, not differentiate, but just to provide a discrete piece of analysis between the two. But yes, very conscious that this has been sort of misused by people that are anti-trans or transphobic. So thank you for raising that, and thanks Luke as well for going back. But yeah, a really important point, that we shouldn't underestimate the power of the acronym being used correctly, and inclusively. Speaking about trans non-binary folks, there's some really interesting stats in this report as well that go down into the country level of trying to understand some of the lived experiences of the trans non-binary communities around the world, particularly as they relate to navigating the world, as trans non-binary people. It did focus a little bit on, well, quite a lot on kind of discrimination and kind of the perception of other parts of the community and non-trans people on, for example, trans folks' access to healthcare and things. So it, in some instances, paints a really positive picture of engagement with the community from those outside. But I would say that there were also some quite worrying statistics that I do think reflect thanks, Luke, we'll link to the survey, that do reflect the not necessarily growing, but certainly I was maybe actually growing, rhetoric around anti-trans rhetoric that we're seeing across the media, which is then supported in many instances by anti-trans policies, bills. If you look at the US, the anti-trans agenda is, gaining momentum. So I wanted to just highlight a couple of stats that really made me think, and really underpin, part of why this conversation around inclusion really matters. So 67% of respondents here felt trans folks faced a, quote, great deal of discrimination, compared with only 19% saying that they perceived not much or not at all. We can then map that to the following stat, which is 76% of respondents then agreed that trans folks should be protected from discrimination, although a disappointing 16% stated that they somewhat strongly disagreed. So there's a tension here in that 67% of respondents saying they know that trans folks are being experiencing this, and 76% saying that they should be protected. There's a ... of, well, why aren't they, or why are they not? So I didn't include quite a lot of the stats around kind of some of the more hurtful aspects, but they are there, and there is still a gap in kind of inclusive support for trans and binary folks. So in this conversation around why this matters, there's some stats for you that really, show that the community as a whole across the world continues to need more. Shrey, any thoughts on those two stats? No. Cool. The next slide goes into a bit more detail on some of those negative stats. So just kind of FYI, we may be talking about some challenging topics. So if this is upsetting to anyone, just heads up. The community is growing, or at least is feeling more comfortable in identifying openly. People are talking about being LGBTQ plus more. Corporate LGBTQ plus DE&I programs are maturing across the board. LGBT Great is here to support you if they're not. Organizations like ours exist because the tide is shifting slowly. There are some front-running places around the world where LGBTQ plus inclusion is on the agenda. There are companies that are leading the way, but this is overwhelmingly not the case when we look at a more macro picture of the world, of the working world, but also the wider world. 70% of LGBTQ plus women and non-binary people reported experiencing discrimination at work. That report then goes on to say within the last 12 months. That was by My G Work, which is a really good report on some of that discrimination that people face in the workplace. 70% is so high, is so unreasonably high that there's something there around making sure that LGBTQ plus women and non-binary people, we understand lived experiences and etc. Shrey, do you want to comment on that?
No, yeah, definitely. As someone who's worked like both in India and like the UK, I feel like, of course, because like it's very hard to navigate the world as someone who's like not conforming to like the dress code or like the binary, and again culturally also very different. And I feel like there's a certain amount of discrimination, even like covertly, that you can just generally feel as well. When like you subtly mentioned that you're part of the community, and especially I think because in like workplace D&I, India is lagging in terms of, because they're still upcoming in terms of legalities, policies and stuff. So I felt like especially there it was slightly I could feel the stat personally in some ways.
Really, yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know
But
whether
yeah,
that's a
here
good,
I
that's
think
obviously a bad thing, but
yeah, I
feeling
mean,
the stat is a good indication that at least in this pool of two people, that speaks to that experience, which is
yeah,
yeah.
no, definitely. But yeah, and I mean, these are grueling stats. Every time I read them, I'm like, wow. I mean, you always think that inclusion has become like an almost an imperative in everyone's minds,
Mm.
but really, we still have so much work to do. But yeah.
Yeah, no, completely. The rest of the stats, I think, paint a very telling picture of what that experience can be like. 66% of LGBTQ plus people reported being the only one out in their workplace. I'm sure in many, an overwhelming majority of cases that, particularly given the number of small businesses globally, that is true. So, if you're an employer and acknowledge that there might only be one LGBTQ plus person, there might be no LGBTQ plus people in your organization, you can still proactively do something to ensure that you kind of future proof the inclusive environment that you want to build in your organization. So what I would say in addition to that, some of those earlier points is that inclusion is not just active, but it can be forward looking as well. So if you want to build an inclusive environment for LGBTQ plus people and you haven't got any in your business, that doesn't matter. You can still build a foundation of policy. You can still build, culture around this. You can still participate in LGBTQ plus Pride Month. You can still partner with charities. You can come to LGBT Great, and we can, work with you and work with our other members. If you want a community or to build a safe community for those employees in the future, and that's really powerful. Actually, I think is kind of owning the need to develop inclusion programs, even as a small business, is really important. For example, you might have an employee network that is intersectional, that focuses on lots of different parts of identity, and that's great. You might not have anyone with that's neurodiverse, but you want to talk about it because people might have siblings or parents or friends or colleagues, etc., in other places from other places that are part of whatever community it is that you're talking about. So I think a point here is that inclusive programs and inclusion initiatives don't always just stay at the workplace. They don't stay within the four walls of the office. They extend into the broader community. And so, the fact that you might not have anyone who's openly, visibly LGBTQ plus at your organization doesn't mean that there's not a son, a daughter, a non-binary person, a cousin, etc., a friend who is part of that community, and that person at work actually wants to, be able to support them. So I think these stats paint a worrying picture, but they paint a picture that can also indicate that we can offset some of this by kind of proactively engaging in some of that inclusion work from the beginning. Oh, Shreya, I can see you come off mute. Do you want to jump in?
Yeah. No, of course, these are very, again, grueling, dejecting stats, but I just wanted to give some nice stats in the new research that we're doing. So we found that 63% LGBTQ plus respondents. I mean, I think I should preface it by saying that, again, just how important inclusion is, even within the workplace and beyond, of course. And they said that 63% LGBTQ plus respondents agreed or strongly agreed that they would be more inclined to apply to an organization that had been assessed for LGBTQ plus sensitivity and inclusion. And the same goes for data sharing. So about 60% said the same about sharing the data. They would be much more inclined to share the data if the organization had been assessed for LGBTQ plus sensitivity and inclusion. And the good thing about it is there's 50% agreed or strongly agreed that the financial services companies are good at promoting LGBTQ plus inclusive initiatives. Which is I felt like I was like, wow, that's a good shift in perspective, because every time I tell my friends from the LGBTQ plus community that I'm like, oh, I work in financial services, they're like, oh, are you included? I'm like, yes, I think so. And there's this perception of the industry which is not very good, but the statistics speak differently, which just shows that we are heading towards a better place.
Nice. Oh, Carlos. Yeah. Great. Thank you, Carlos. Yeah. So a point that that people have come and said, that people in their community and in their families identify as being LGBTQ plus. So these programs and initiatives help, even when not as overtly as you might think. Cool. Okay. I'll move on just in the last 10 minutes. In terms of just kind of the latest things that we're seeing around the world in terms of inclusion, in terms of the latest reports and or news. Shrey, do you want to just talk everyone through kind of what you're seeing from a trends perspective?
Of course, thank you. I feel like we have, so of course, I think we always create this binary between trends to just bucket it, categorize it sometimes, but I'll focus on each trend a bit more specifically. But I feel like the US news was very uplifting to me. because I mean, normally everything that you hear is, oh no, something transphobic. But this time the district court judge actually denied a motion to any state restrictions that the state might pursue for healthcare for transgender adults, which is, I think, a good step, especially how given how the US political climate is. I personally really like the one in Brazil. They're like, you know what, homophobia is punishable by prison. Like they were very clear about it. They're like, you'll go to jail if you're mean to everyone and like hateful, which I think is a good move personally, because I mean, as someone who's grown up in like the global south, like homophobia is a very prevalent narrative, like a very common like norm, which is I find obviously problematic. But yeah, I mean, I feel like this is a good step from Brazil, and hopefully other countries also implement something similar. Um, Basically a negative reinforcement. England, again, not doing that well. I'm sorry, England. But like the trans and non-binary community is not included in women's badminton in England, which I think just I don't understand, especially like even with like the chess news piece that we recently heard about, like how trans people are excluded from chess, and they're only allowed in open competitions, is also like mind-blowing to me. Australia, half of all trans people have experienced hate online or in person. That is pretty grueling again. And but there's also relative good news, which is that like another research report has come out with, in Australia, I think conducted by the University of Melbourne, saying that transgender healthcare is life-saving, and they did a longitudinal study from 2020 to 2023, I think, and that basically gives more like bureaucrats and politicians statistical data to actually implement policies for transgender healthcare, which is good. And finally, this is my favorite one personally. The Andorran Prime Minister just came out as gay. And I feel like I think that's my personal favorite, because whenever people who can actually influence policies come out, there is this certain like shift in perspective where people are like, okay, even people in power can be part of the LGBTQ plus community. It's not just like the people who are like trying to fight for rights on the ground. So people, whenever someone in power comes out, I'm like, wow, that's very good for like policy in the future. And again, when I read that, and I think his statement was very clear. He was like, "Oh, I don't think like I've always been gay and I will always be gay," and something around those lines. And I was like, "Wow!" Like reading his interview was very uplifting to me. But yeah, I think those are some of the stats and the global trends that have been happening over the past month, I would suppose, and they will be included in our digest, which will go out on Monday. And for a more comprehensive view of what LGBT Great thinks, please do read the digest.
Great. Thanks, Shay. Okay, cool. We've got 7 minutes left. Everyone who there's a couple of questions in Slido, so we will cover those. I think that's kind of all we had to share with you just in terms of the stats. I appreciate that. That was sort of fairly data heavy, but I thought that there's so many conversations around inclusion focus on specific lived experiences. Sometimes we forget just how important some of this data is in helping people to tell different parts of that story, particularly in the context of engaging with senior stakeholders internally. For anyone who's engaged in DE&I work, having some of those stats to hand can be really helpful in grounding the conversation effectively. So I just wanted to share a few of those with you. So I hope that was useful and interesting. I've put the Slido link back up. Please do feel free to scan this QR code to drop any formal questions that you have into the Q&A, or I can see that people have been using the chat function instead, which is also fine. So do drop any of those, but we'll cover off some of the questions here. I'll tackle the easy one first, or not the easy one, but the question is, what can we do to support colleagues who may have LGBTQ plus family members but not be out about it at work? I think the family conversation is really interesting, and we've spoken to many stakeholders who say, "Oh, my child's just come out," or "My child's gender queer," or whatever, and they have then become some of the most active members of networks. They have been very engaged. So I think the first thing I would say is, in all instances, for those allies to be included, because you never know quite what the motivations are for someone to get involved in those programs. Um, I think it's important for organizations to provide those safe spaces and connection opportunities for people. So, talking about families, talking about content, talking about the basics again, providing people with mentoring opportunities is a great way. LGBT Great has a mentoring program. If particularly if your child's just come out, get involved in some mentoring with an LGBTQ plus person. And I would say generally get closer to the issues and the history of the community that your family member is part of. Learn about, read LGBTQ plus media, engage with it. If they're bi, read about what does it mean to be bi, etc. There's lots of great content out there as well that you could share or watch if it's a child or young person. Then things like Heartstopper, books and things like that are really good. So speak through the lens of content. If you don't actually know, if you don't feel comfortable saying it yourself, then use content as a means to begin or maintain that conversation, I would say. And speak up. Yeah. So I think that's what I would say. Shreya, what would you add?
No, like I feel like everything that you said is super important. And as like whenever my like one of my family members also just shares something like LGBTQ plus, I feel very empowered because I'm like, wow, that's great. They're also reading about like LGBTQ plus issues, news, and any shift from like the heteronormative narrative into or like the LGBTQ plus community, what's happening, and even if they share it very casually, I really personally love it. So I think some personally, I feel like those small gestures really matter, and you can do that. You can always and ask them how they're doing. Just generally, also is very like important because in from like an LGBTQ plus lens, which can be sometimes a bit tricky. But my one of my family members does it sometimes, and they're like, "Oh yeah, did you see like the news here? And how are you doing?" And it's very kind and sweet, and I really like it.
Hmm,
I feel like personally for me that works. But yeah.
nice. Yeah, that's good. I think definitely taking them on that journey with you if you can. Um, as much as you can, and it has real kind of value. Um, I do think content is so important in beginning and maintaining this conversation. Social media is great as well. Yeah, start with something that you think is manageable, and then work up to it from there. Okay, cool. The other question we've had is a something that giving 3 minutes to probably doesn't actually do justice to the conversation. But we've had a question here. How do you combat transphobia in the workplace when the individuals use protected belief under the Equalities Act as defense for their hate? So, that's a big question. That's a very nuanced issue. There is quite a lot to say. I would say that beginning this conversation will necessarily mean navigating personal, beliefs and positions as much as organizational ones. So it can become a thorny issue, in inverted commas. But I think it's worth acknowledging that I think Luke has posted a reply, but I'll just read some of that out because it's very well expressed. But the protected belief is shorthand for something that is much more nuanced, and it's not always straightforward. So there's the CIPD guide that's very good, that explains things well, and that in many instances, thanks, Luke. Yeah, protected belief. There are certain criteria under which something can be described as a protected belief. What I would say is that organizations have a duty of care to trans and binary employees, first and foremost. And there are some principles that surround that duty of care. Protected belief, when it's held, and by a person, is absolutely fine. But as soon as it becomes what this person has just said, hate, there are some demonstrable ways of establishing what that is, and discrimination and things. So if it strays into open and overt discrimination, then the organization has a duty of care to crack down on that. And in many instances, that's what will happen. So the kind of challenge becomes when it's kind of covert and malicious. So excluding trans people explicitly, for example, continually. It's not necessarily something that you could say, oh, that's discrimination, but are things that you could reasonably say are motivated by that position. So in that instance, it's really important to build a principles-led approach as an organization, and to be very clear in what you stand for as an organization, or as a team. So it is a new, nuanced and case by case issue. But I would say for me, the guiding principles are no one should have to suffer discrimination at work, full stop. And when those protected beliefs, manifest as discrimination or as overt kind of transphobia, that people are systematically, ostracizing people or openly discriminating, that the organization has a duty of care to clamp down on that. But within the UK, at least, holding those beliefs, it is completely legal. So as long as how organizations build those cultures, where those beliefs, can be held, is, yeah, I think part of the conversation. But Luke sent some good materials. So in the interest of time, I will close the session here. But on those, if anyone has any further questions on those questions, please do feel free to reach out directly, and we can have a more comprehensive discussion with you. But yeah, Shrey, any last words from you?
All good. Thank you for attending, everyone. And
Yeah.
this was really like I had a lot of fun just delivering it. But yeah.
Great. Okay, fabulous. Okay, well, thanks everyone, and I'm wishing you all a great rest of the week. Catch you later. Bye.